The apartment had been empty for years before Daniel moved in, though nobody could quite agree on how many. The landlord said 5. The woman at the bakery across the street said closer to 15. The old man who sat outside the building every afternoon simply shook his head and muttered, "Long enough." Daniel didn't care much for rumors. The rent was cheap, the location was good, and he needed somewhere quiet to work. That was all that mattered. On his first night, he noticed the smell. It wasn't strong, just faint enough to question whether it was really there. Something like old wood soaked in dampness, mixed with a trace of something metallic. He opened the windows, let in the cool evening air, and convinced himself it would fade. It didn't. By the third night, the smell had settled into the walls like a memory that refused to leave. Daniel began to notice other things too. The apartment was strangely cold, even when the heating worked fine. Sounds carried oddly through the space, as if the rooms were slightly larger than they appeared. At night, when he lay in bed, he sometimes heard faint tapping from somewhere deep inside the walls. Not pipes, not settling wood. Something more deliberate. Tap, 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 tap. He tried to ignore it, but patterns began to form, always in threes, always at irregular intervals. One night, unable to sleep, he got up and pressed his ear against the wall. The tapping stopped instantly. The silence that followed felt heavier than the sound itself. The next morning, he noticed a mark on the wall where he had been listening. A small crack, thin as a hair, running vertically from floor to ceiling. He was certain it hadn't been there before. Days passed, and the crack widened, just slightly at first, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. But Daniel was looking for it. He couldn't stop. Something about that line in the wall drew his attention constantly, like an itch behind the eyes. One evening, as the sun dipped below the buildings across the street, the crack made a sound, a faint, dry creak. Daniel froze. The room felt colder than ever. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the crack widened by a fraction. And from within it came a whisper. At first, he thought it was his imagination. The sound was too soft, too indistinct. But it came again. Not words exactly, more like the suggestion of speech. Breath shaped into something almost meaningful. Daniel stepped back, his heart pounding. "Hello?" he said, feeling foolish the moment the word left his mouth. The whisper stopped. The apartment fell silent again. He laughed nervously, shook his head, and told himself he was tired, overworked, stressed. That night, the tapping returned, louder this time, more insistent. Tap, 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 tap. It went on for hours. Daniel covered his ears with a pillow, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. Walls, ceiling, even the floor beneath him. At some point, he fell asleep despite it. When he woke, the apartment felt different. The air was heavier, the smell stronger, and the crack in the wall had widened enough to reveal darkness behind it, not the usual shadow of a hollow space. This was deeper, thicker, as if the wall contained not insulation or beams, but something vast and empty. Daniel approached it slowly. The whisper returned the moment he got close. This time, it was clearer, not understandable, but undeniably human. A voice speaking just beyond comprehension. He leaned closer, straining to hear. The voice seemed to react, growing louder, more urgent. Words began to form at the edge of recognition. "See," Daniel's breath caught. "What?" he asked, barely above a whisper. "See, me?" He stumbled back, his heart racing. "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "No, that's not. This isn't real." But the voice continued. "See, me." It wasn't pleading. It wasn't threatening. It was simply stating something over and over as if it had been waiting a very long time to be heard. Daniel grabbed his phone and searched for the landlord's number. When the man answered, Daniel tried to explain the crack, the voice, the tapping. There was a long silence on the other end. Then the landlord sighed. "I told you the rent was cheap," he said. "What does that mean?" Daniel demanded. "It means," the landlord replied carefully, "that previous tenants didn't stay long." "Because of this?" "Because of something," the landlord said. "Look, if you want to leave, you can. I won't hold you to the lease." Daniel hesitated. Leaving would mean starting over again. More expenses, more uncertainty, and besides, a part of him was curious. "No," he said finally. "I'll stay." There was another pause. "Then don't listen to it," the landlord said quietly. "That's the only advice I can give you." The line went dead. That night, Daniel tried to follow that advice. He put on headphones, turned the volume up, and drowned out the apartment with music. For a while, it worked. But when the song ended, the silence that followed was broken by something new. Not tapping, not whispering, breathing, slow, steady, coming from the crack in the wall. Daniel removed the headphones, his hands trembling. The breathing continued. Inhale, exhale, as if something on the other side of the wall was alive, watching, waiting. "See, me," the voice said again, clearer than ever. Daniel stood up, drawn toward the crack despite himself. The darkness within it seemed to shift, as though it were not empty at all, but filled with something that didn't quite exist, in the same way as the room around him. "Who are you?" he whispered. For the first time, the voice answered differently. "Who, you?" Daniel frowned. "What?" "Oh, you," it repeated. The breathing grew louder, closer. The darkness within the crack deepened, spreading slightly into the room like ink in water. Daniel felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of vertigo, as if the floor beneath him had tilted. He staggered back, grabbing onto a chair for support. The room seemed wrong, the angles slightly off, the walls subtly warped. And then he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The crack wasn't just in the wall anymore, it had spread. Thin lines branching out from the original fracture, crawling across the surface like veins. And from each of them came the same whisper. "See, me. See, me. See, me." Dozens of voices now overlapping, echoing. Daniel covered his ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't just external anymore, it was inside his head. He stumbled toward the door, desperate to leave, but as he reached for the handle, the apartment shifted again. The door was farther away than it should have been. The hallway beyond it stretched unnaturally long, and at the end of that hallway, barely visible in the dim light, stood a figure. It was tall, thin, motionless. Daniel blinked, and it was closer, not by much, but enough to notice. "See, me," the voices whispered. Daniel turned back toward the crack. The darkness within it had expanded, filling a large portion of the wall now. And within that darkness, something moved, a shape. Humanoid, but distorted, as if seen through warped glass. It pressed against the inside of the crack, stretching it wider. A hand emerged first. Pale, too long, fingers bending at unnatural angles, it reached into the room, grasping at the air. Daniel screamed and stumbled backward. The figure in the hallway moved again, closer now, its features still indistinct but undeniably present. Trapped between the two, Daniel felt the apartment closing in around him. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting in time with the sound from the crack. The hand from the wall reached farther, followed by an arm, then a shoulder. The thing was forcing its way through. "See me," it whispered. Now, with a clarity that was almost conversational, the figure in the hallway tilted its head as if observing him. Daniel realized, with a sickening clarity, that they were the same. Whatever was coming through the wall was already inside the apartment. He lunged for the door and ran. The hallway stretched endlessly before him, the figure always just a few steps behind. No matter how fast he moved, he couldn't seem to gain distance. The whispers filled the space, growing louder, more insistent. "See me. See me. See me." Daniel finally reached the stairwell and burst through the door, collapsing onto the steps. The sounds stopped instantly. Silence, complete and absolute. He stayed there for a long time, breathing heavily, afraid to move. When he finally looked back, the hallway was normal again, empty. The apartment door stood closed as if nothing had happened. Daniel left the building that night. He didn't take his things. He didn't look back. Days later, he tried to convince himself it had been a hallucination. Stress, lack of sleep, anything but what it felt like. But sometimes, late at night, when the world was quiet, he would hear it again. Faint, distant, coming from somewhere he couldn't quite place. Tap, 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 tap. And beneath it, just at the edge of hearing, "See me?" Daniel tried to rebuild something resembling a normal life, but the problem with leaving a place like that is it doesn't really let you go. At first, it was just the sounds, the faint tapping at night, always in threes, always irregular. He moved to a different part of the city, then another. It didn't matter. The sound followed. Quiet at first, easy to dismiss. Pipes, neighbors, coincidence, but it never stopped. And then came the smell, that same faint metallic dampness seeping into his new apartment as if it had always been there. He scrubbed the floors, opened every window, bought air fresheners, candles, anything to mask it. Nothing worked. The smell wasn't in the air. It was somewhere deeper. One night, about 2 weeks after he left the old apartment, Daniel noticed a mark on his bedroom wall, a thin line, vertical, barely visible unless you caught it in the right light. His stomach dropped. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no." He backed away, shaking his head, refusing to look at it. But the moment he turned his back, he felt it. That same pressure, that same awareness, as if something on the other side of that wall had just noticed him noticing it. The tapping began again. Tap, 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 tap. Louder now, closer. Daniel covered his ears, but the rhythm forced its way through, echoing inside his skull. He didn't sleep that night, or the next. By the third night, the line had grown, just like before. Not much, just enough that he couldn't pretend it wasn't happening, and the whisper returned. "See me?" This time, he didn't respond. He sat in the far corner of the room, staring at the opposite wall, refusing to acknowledge it. The landlord's words echoed in his mind. Don't listen to it. But ignoring something like that isn't as simple as it sounds. The voice didn't just come from the crack anymore. It came from everywhere, from behind him, from inside his head, from places that didn't make sense. "Ah, see, me. It was patient, unhurried, as if it knew time didn't matter. Days blurred together. Daniel stopped going outside, stopped answering calls. He covered the crack with furniture, then with blankets, then with anything he could find. It didn't help. The whisper seeped through everything, and the crack kept growing. One evening, as the light faded, Daniel noticed something new. The shadows in the room were wrong. They didn't match the objects casting them. The chair in the corner stretched longer than it should. The table's shadow bent at impossible angles. And the crack had no shadow at all. It absorbed light instead, a thin vertical absence that seemed to deepen the longer he stared at it. See? Me? Daniel clenched his eyes shut. You're not real, he muttered. You're not real. Silence followed. For a moment he thought it had worked. Then, very softly, right beside his ear, Then why did you leave? His eyes snapped open. The room looked the same, but it felt different, occupied. He turned slowly, and there, standing just a few feet away, was the figure. Clearer now than it had ever been before. Tall, thin, its limbs slightly too long, its posture slightly off, like a person imitating a human shape from memory. Its face, if it could be called that, was smooth and featureless except for a faint suggestion of where eyes and a mouth should be. And yet, Daniel could feel it looking at him, studying him. See, me, it said, though its face didn't move. Daniel couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The figure tilted its head, mirroring that same curious motion from before. You left, it continued, but you took it with you. Daniel shook his head frantically. No, I didn't. I left that place. The figure took a step closer. The room seemed to stretch with it, distances warping subtly. It was never the place, it said. The words felt wrong, like they were being forced into a shape they didn't belong to. It was the space. Daniel frowned, confusion cutting through his fear. What does that mean? The figure raised one elongated hand and pointed, not at the wall, not at the crack, but at him. You made space, it said. The tapping began again, not from the wall this time, from inside his chest. Tap, 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 tap. Daniel gasped, clutching at himself as the rhythm pulsed through his body. When you listened, the figure continued, you opened it. The crack in the wall split wider with a dry, splintering sound. Darkness poured out, not like a liquid, but like the absence of everything. And within it, shapes moved, many shapes, all pressing forward, all reaching. See, me, the voices whispered, now countless. Daniel stumbled back, his mind racing. I can close it, he said desperately. I just have to ignore it, right? That's what he said. I just have to. The figure shook its head slowly. You can't close what you've already seen. The darkness spread across the wall, then the ceiling, then the floor, swallowing the room piece by piece. The edges of reality seemed to fray where it touched, like fabric unraveling. Daniel backed into the corner, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Then what do you want? He cried. The figure stepped closer again, now towering over him. For a moment it said nothing. Then, softly, almost gently, to be seen. And before Daniel could react, the figure reached out and placed its hand against his face. The world twisted. The apartment vanished. And Daniel found himself somewhere else. A space that wasn't a space. Endless, dark, filled with cracks stretching in every direction, and within each crack, something moved, something waiting, something watching. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. He tried to move, but there was no ground beneath him, only the sensation of falling, or maybe sinking. And all around him, the whisper grew louder. See me, see me, see me. Then suddenly, silence. Daniel stood in his apartment again. Everything was normal. The walls were intact. The air was still. The smell was gone. He looked around, trembling. "Hello?" he whispered. No answer, no tapping, no whisper, nothing. He waited. Minutes passed, then hours. Nothing happened. Days went by. Still nothing. The crack never returned. The sounds never came back. It was over. It had to be. Slowly, cautiously, Daniel began to relax. He cleaned the apartment, opened the windows, let sunlight fill the space. Life crept back in, piece by piece. Weeks later, he almost believed it had all been a nightmare. Until one evening, while brushing his teeth, he glanced at his reflection and noticed something that made his blood turn to ice. Behind him, in the mirror, not in the room itself, but only in the reflection, the wall was different, covered in thin, branching cracks, and from within those cracks, countless shapes pressed outward, just barely visible, watching, waiting. Daniel turned around instantly. The wall behind him was normal, smooth, unbroken. He looked back at the mirror. The cracks were still there, and as he stared, one of the shapes moved closer, its outline becoming clearer, familiar. It raised a hand, and Daniel realized with a slow dawning horror it was mimicking him. He lifted his own hand, almost without thinking. The reflection followed, but not perfectly. Its movements lagged slightly, delayed, independent, and then it spoke, not from the room, not from the mirror, but from somewhere inside him. "Now they can see you too." Daniel didn't move for a long time. His hand was still raised, hovering in the air, while the thing in the mirror held the same pose, just a fraction of a second behind. That delay was the worst part. Not perfectly synchronized, not a reflection. Something learning him. Slowly, he lowered his hand. The figure followed, late again, always late, like it was watching, processing, then copying. His breathing became shallow, careful, controlled. He didn't want to give it anything more than necessary, but it was already watching everything, absorbing, memorizing. He stepped back from the sink. The reflection stayed where it was for a moment, then adjusted, catching up. Daniel turned away from the mirror completely. "This isn't happening," he whispered. The words felt empty now, worn out, useless. Behind him, from the bathroom, tap, 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 tap. He froze. It was louder than ever before, not in the walls, not distant, right there, close. He turned his head slightly, just enough to see the edge of the mirror again. The cracks had spread further, branching across the entire reflected wall, crawling toward the edges of the glass. And the shapes behind them were clearer now. Faces, or approximations of faces, pressed against the fractures, their features indistinct but undeniably there. Watching him, waiting for him to look directly at them, he snapped his gaze away. "See? Me?" they whispered, overlapping, layered, endless. Daniel backed out of the bathroom, his pulse hammering. "No," he said under his breath. "No more." He grabbed a towel from a nearby chair and returned, moving fast this time, before hesitation could take hold. Without looking at the mirror, he threw the towel over it, covering the entire surface. The whispers stopped instantly. Silence fell, heavy, oppressive. Daniel stood there, staring at the draped cloth, chest rising and falling. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. No sound, no movement. Slowly, carefully, he stepped closer. The towel hung still. No shifting, no sign of anything behind it. He reached out and pressed his palm against the fabric. For a second, there was nothing. Then, something pressed back. Daniel recoiled as if burned, stumbling away. The towel bulged outward slightly, as if something behind it had leaned forward. A hand-shaped impression formed against the cloth. Too long, too thin. The fingers spread, slowly stretching the fabric. "See me." The voice was clearer now, not distant, not inside his head. Right there, muffled only slightly by the towel. The hand pressed harder. The fabric strained. Daniel looked around frantically, his eyes landing on a small metal stool near the door. He grabbed it and, without giving himself time to think, swung it hard against the mirror. The glass shattered with a violent crack. The sound echoed unnaturally, stretching longer than it should have. The towel fell away as shards rained down onto the sink and floor. Daniel stumbled back, breathing hard. For a moment, nothing. Then he looked down. The broken pieces of the mirror lay scattered across the tiles, and in every shard he saw it. Not one reflection, many. Each piece showed a slightly different angle, a slightly different delay, dozens of versions of himself, all moving just a fraction too late, and behind each of them, in every fragment, the cracks spread deeper, and the shapes pressed closer. One shard shifted, just slightly. Daniel's eyes locked onto it. In that piece, his reflection hadn't moved at all. It was still staring directly at him, even though Daniel himself had turned away. "See me," it said. The voice came from everywhere at once now. From the shards, from the air, from inside his chest again. Tap, 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 tap. The rhythm was faster this time, urgent, panicked, or excited. The reflections began to move independently, subtly at first. Small differences in posture, slight tilts of the head, then more. One smiled, just barely. Daniel's stomach dropped. "Stop," he said, his voice breaking. "Just stop." The tapping intensified. The shards trembled slightly on the floor, vibrating in time with the sound. One by one, the reflections began to turn, not following Daniel, but turning toward him. Their eyes, now clearly visible, locked onto his position outside the glass, watching him the way he had once watched the crack, the way he had leaned in, the way he had listened. "You made space," the voice said again, no longer tied to any single source. "Now they have somewhere to be." The shards began to slide, slowly at first, then faster, scraping across the tiles toward him. Daniel backed away, but there were too many. They formed a loose circle around his feet, each piece angled upward like 100 tiny windows, and in every one, the figures were closer, pressing harder, reaching. A hand emerged from one shard, not breaking through, but slipping out, as if the boundary between reflection and reality had thinned. Then another and another. Pale fingers clawed onto the floor, pulling, dragging unseen bodies forward. Daniel turned and ran out of the apartment, into the hallway, down the stairs. He didn't stop this time. He didn't look back. The tapping followed him, echoing through his bones. Tap, 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 tap. Faster now, matching his heartbeat, or maybe becoming it. Outside, the night air hit him like a shock. He stumbled into the street, gasping, looking around wildly. Everything seemed normal. People passed by, cars moved, lights flickered in windows. The world was intact, untouched. But as he stood there, trembling, trying to convince himself he had escaped again. He noticed something that made his legs go weak. In the windows of the buildings around him, dozens of them reflecting the street back at him, he saw the cracks, faint at first, barely there, but spreading. And in those reflections, the shapes were there too, watching from behind the glass, learning, waiting. One of the passers-by slowed, glancing at Daniel with mild concern. "Are you okay?" the man asked. Daniel opened his mouth to answer, but before he could speak, he saw it. In the man's eyes, reflected in the dark pupils, tiny, fractured lines, and something moving behind them. The man tilted his head slightly, not unlike the figure had. "You look like you've seen something," he said. Daniel stumbled back. "No," he whispered. "No, I didn't mean to. I didn't." The man smiled faintly, not unkindly, but not normally either. "That's how it starts," he said softly. Around them, the city continued as usual, unaware, unseeing. But in every reflective surface, windows, screens, puddles, even the gloss of passing cars, the cracks were there now, subtle, growing, spreading from one surface to another, from one person to the next. Daniel realized, with a hollow, sinking certainty, that it was never contained, not in the apartment, not in the walls. It moved through attention, through observation, through being seen, and he had seen it, really seen it. He tried to squeeze his eyes shut, to block it out, but it was too late for that, because now, even in the darkness behind his eyelids, he could still see them, waiting, pressed against the thin, invisible barrier of perception. See me, and somewhere deep inside him,